I wanted to open with a text from Rav Kook, who was the first chief rabbi of Mandate Palestine. He lived from 1865 to 1935. And this is a text of his. It was written in Hebrew, but I'm going to say it in English. There is a person who sings the song of the self. He finds everything his complete spiritual satisfaction within himself. And there is a person who sings the song of the nation. He steps forward from his private self, which he finds narrow and insufficiently developed. He yearns for the heights. He clings with a sensitive love to the entirety of the Jewish nation and sings with its song. He shares in its pain, its joyful and its hopes, speaks with exalted and pure thoughts regarding its past and its future, investigates its inner spiritual nature with love and a wise heart. There is a person whose soul is so broad that it expands beyond the border of Israel. It sings the song of humanity. This soul constantly grows broader with the exalted totality of humanity and its glorious image. He yearns for humanity's general enlightenment. He looks forward to its supernal perfection. From this source of life, he draws all of his thoughts and insights, his ideals and visions. And there is a person who rises even higher until he unites with all existence, with all creatures and with all worlds. And with all of them, he sings. This is the person who, engaged in the chapter of song every day, is assured that he is a child of the world to come. And there is a person who rises with all these songs together in one ensemble, so that they all give forth their voices. They all sing their songs sweetly. Each supplies its fellow with fullness of life, the voice of happiness and joy, the voice of rejoicing and tunefulness, the voice of merriment and the voice of holiness. The song of the soul, the song of the nation, the song of humanity, the song of the world, they all mix together with this person at every moment and at all times. And this simplicity in its fullness rises to become a song of holiness, a song of God, the song that is simple, double, triple, quadrupled, the song of songs of Solomon, which is the song of ruler whose very name is peace. I think this text from Rav Kook expresses in some way the multi-layered nature of what it means to be a religious person in this case. I can only speak for my own faith and people and religion, that we live a complex identity. We're ourselves, we're just one. We're part of some kind of greater people, nation, religious community, which Rav Kook, interestingly enough, is in British Mandate Palestine, so he's post-17th century and pre the establishment of the State of Israel. But he still articulates a notion of nation. The third is that we're part of humanity. We're part of every people who is human. And finally, we're part of a world which is ultimately God's world, that is beyond what it means to be a human and more part of a collective notion that lands, people, things, creation are all part of one existence. And what I love about this beautiful text is that it honors all of those truths. It doesn't say one doesn't exist or shouldn't exist. It honors that we're multi-layered, and in some sense I think it acknowledges that the hope is somewhere that we're moving along the spectrum. That there is an ultimate goal that would you feel a part of ultimately, which he calls peace, which is another name of God, Shalom. So, but that's not always so simple. And I think he wouldn't have created the text if he thought it were so simple, right? Because we don't have texts that just say nice things and we think we can achieve them at all times. And I think we try to hold all those worlds simultaneously that flow one to the next without conflict, but the truth is when reality lives, so does the tension in that reality. Is that better? Okay. So there is an underlying current of the song that recognizes that there are inherent tensions between the individual and the collective. What I need is not necessarily what the collective of the nation needs. There are underlying tensions between an outsider-insider status, who am I versus am I a part of something larger than myself? There are underlying tensions with particularism and universalism, that we're part of a nation, but we're also part of humanity. And each of those grant us a certain identity with accompanying values that animate those identities. And then there is a very human-centric understanding of the universe, which is, in sometimes, at least according to Rav Kook, in tension with how God might see the universe. And so what I think this song does, and I think is deeply true about the Jewish tradition and the Jewish religion, and the Jewish people in some ways, is one, all of those pieces are inclusive, are a part of our tradition. The Jewish tradition has a very strong notion of self and agency. The Jewish tradition has a very strong notion of nation. And just to focus on Silas's point that there was no notion of nation before the 17th century, I would say the more Jewish notion is of peoplehood. Am is the word in Hebrew for people, Am Yisrael, the people of Israel. And so the recognition, and there is also notion of collective humanity in the Jewish tradition. There is a lot of conversation in the Jewish tradition about being part of a larger world. Part of that was also true because the Jewish people lived as a less empowered community amongst a larger whole and had to navigate what it meant to be a part of something that they weren't sovereign over. And then also there is the notion that God is ultimately the one who is in charge of everything. When there is a talk about the land, Eretz, in the Bible it says, Ki li kol haaretz, for me is the land, which is why certain laws evolve out of that which are the sabbatical year, that we're not meant to work the land for ourselves. So there are all these layers that exist in the tradition, but I'd like to focus particularly on the notion of the stranger in the Jewish tradition, which is, I think, the driver of this conversation of how does an insider versus outsider, native-born versus non-native-born, and what does that even mean? And there's one word in Hebrew that encapsulates that whole story, of which the Bible, particularly from the book of Exodus onward, is obsessed with. Which is, and when I talk about the Bible, I would say primarily the 5 books of Moses, which is the Jewish Torah. Although our Bible is the Old Testament, as some would say, but from a cyclical reading in the Jewish year, we go by the 5 books of Moses. So from Exodus through Deuteronomy, there is an obsession with who is the ger, who is what is often translated as stranger. So the word in Hebrew, ger, is often translated as stranger, but is used in many ways that one could question the notion of what actually does that mean. So I want to point to a handful of biblical texts that highlight the usage of that word and kind of what we might take away from that in reflecting upon this question of nation, refugee, asylum seeker, etc. So in Leviticus 24:22, it says, there will be one law, the same for a ger as a native born, for I am Adonai your God. So there is one law for the ger and the native born, which is understood to be an Israelite in this case. And so here we see in Leviticus, this is, just in terms of the narrative of the Torah, we've gotten out of Egypt, which is part of the reason there's such an obsession with the notion of who a stranger is. But in this instance, when you talk, this one line in the book of Leviticus says the answer to the question of should everyone be treated under one law is yes, no matter whether you're native born or you're not. And so one might, in this case, not necessarily translate the word ger as stranger, because when you're talking about a law, sovereign notion of law, you're talking about a political entity. And that means that in some way one could call this an immigrant, or a refugee, or an asylum seeker, someone who is in your midst and is asked, are they in or are they out? Are they treated with the same rights and privileges as the collective whole of the native born or not. And so biblically, in the book of Leviticus, there is a notion that the laws that are applied to the Israelites are also applied to non-native Israelites. And this is a running theme throughout the Torah, and I'll just cite a handful of other examples. It says in Exodus 22, you shall not wrong or oppress a ger. You shall not wrong or oppress a stranger, refugee, immigrant. I'm gonna keep saying the Hebrew because I think it's not good to translate it. For you were gerim in the land of Egypt. For you, because we as the Jewish people were gerim, we were strangers, immigrants, refugees in the land of Egypt. Another citation in Leviticus 19, when a ger resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the ger. The ger who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the ger as yourself, for you were gerim in the land of Egypt. I am Adonai your God. So again, there is this obsession with recognizing that there are insiders and outsiders in a certain way, but they're treated collectively under the same rule of law. And in some way, there's an extended notion, not that they're only treated as citizens, but they're loved. Right? This is not only legal language, it's also emotional, spiritual language. And then in Deuteronomy 10, for Adonai your God is the God of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who is not partial and takes no bribes, who executes justice for the orphan, the widow, and who loves the ger, providing them with food and clothing. You shall also love the ger, for you were gerim in the land of Egypt. So here you could see these citations, and one, there's this notion that we don't oppress the ger, that we don't take advantage, that there is a heightened awareness in the Jewish tradition of, and a sensitivity to the outsider, the stranger among us who's not native born, who might have gotten into the spaces we're in for whatever reason. It doesn't actually discuss it. It just said there is acknowledgement that we're not homogeneous, and those that are living amongst us are varied and different, and that we have to pay particular attention to those who are not citizens as we would understand them to be. The second is that there's a notion of loving the ger, which probably is spoken about because our natural sometimes reaction is to pull away from the ger. You know, sometimes I think commandments are generated because God or whoever wrote the Torah, I'm not going to have that kind of theological conversation now, but there is a recognition that it may actually be unnatural to love the stranger. We see that manifest in our world in countless ways, from when we walk the streets to how nations treat other people in their midst. And so the Torah is obsessed, and I don't use that word lightly, it's obsessed. It says more often than any commandment is the notion of protecting the stranger. And finally, the underlying reason for this, besides that God is who God is that because you've been there. That's your story, and the lesson learned from having been a ger is to not have anyone experience what we as the Jewish people in Israel, in Egypt experienced. So these are the dynamic ways that I think the Jewish tradition has, from a biblical sense, has been caught up with the notion of there are always going to be people in your midst who are not part of your people, or are not part of your borders as understood. And there's a robust response to that from a biblical perspective. And I just want to add one other source to that, which occurs in Deuteronomy 23, where it says, and you know, this is our Torah, the Jewish people's Torah, which we read every week. You shall not abhor, we don't read this section every week, but this is our cycle. You shall not abhor any of the Edomites, for they are your kin. You shall not abhor any of the Egyptians, because you were a ger residing in their land. The children of the third generation that are born to them may be admitted to the assembly of God. It's kind of astounding, given how the leitmotif of the Jewish tradition also is about having been slaves in Egypt and getting out, that the Torah itself, in a sense, not undermines its narrative, But that movement from slavery to freedom doesn't give you permission to abhor an Egyptian, the people who enslaved you. There's a recognition, and the reason given for that is because they were hospitable to you when there was famine in the lands of Canaan, when the Israelites didn't have food in the land. They went to Egypt to get food, and ultimately became enslaved. But the Torah holds on to that notion that actually the Egyptians were hospitable to us at the beginning. When we were Gerim, it ultimately led to enslavement. But that notion that we were all kin, that the song of humanity reigns, sustains itself, and the Bible, the Torah, is particularly attentive to not ruling out the possibility that someone is seen as your kin. So I want to add one other layer to the notion of what ger is in the Jewish tradition. If you hear the word ger in our time, you might also think, ger means a convert. So someone who joins the Jewish people really religiously. So the same language, the same name is used for someone who becomes part of the Jewish religion as a ger. And all the things that apply to the stranger that was in the Torah then come to apply to how we treat the person who joins our people. So there is much in the Jewish sources of the protection for the ger because we were gerim, and it is a leitmotif of the Jewish tradition. And I think we see that manifest also in terms of the Jewish people, particularly in our country when questions of immigration and refugees and asylum seekers, I would say it's in some way the one, I don't know about this is fully true, but a huge percentage of the Jewish community is on board politically when it comes to questions of immigration, asylum seekers, and refugees. It's one of the few things the Jewish community in America actually agree upon. And that is because of this historic notion of protecting the ger. Now I want to obviously complicate this, I'm sure people are thinking this as I'm speaking, is that the Jewish people did not have political sovereignty for thousands of years and had this longing of returning to Eretz, which is the land, the territory, of which at one point it was not sovereign state, but it was certainly holy land. And now these notions of what it means to embody these principles are much easier to purport when you're not sovereign in your own land. And the Jewish narrative is now, it has the components of history, people, as Silas said, now it had a longing for land, but now it's actually living on a land, which has made, in some sense, was a great miracle for the Jewish people, more complicated for other people living in that land, the Palestinians as well as the surrounding nations. But now, once this wandering people that had no land now has a land, there are many challenges as to how to translate these deeply held beliefs and opinions as a sovereign state that has the historical experience of being victims, most profoundly in the Holocaust, and is wrestling with how does one hold territory, people, historical narrative, and sovereignty at the same time, with issues of security and safety all at the same time. So there's a question of how the Jewish people in the United States, right, deal with these kinds of questions, and obviously there are questions about how the land, the state at this point, the nation state of Israel, which has had significant challenges on these questions, most recently with the African Eritrean refugees that have, there are 50,000 that are in the lands of Israel and the state of Israel these days, and it's been much on the news. So all I can say, I don't have any sweet answers to that question. Obviously, I have opinions. But I just want to say in some way this raises up the greatest challenge and privilege of the Jewish people, which in thousands of years, which is now forced in some way to wrestle with the values that have been animating its existence without land, traditions and laws which have been at the cornerstone of our self-understanding, which of course now need to be in dialogue with the reality of issues of safety and security and what it means to be a nation state that is not only filled with Jews.